of no lynchings. Guardian, 8 January 1953. This year has been a harrowing one in America in many ways, but in one respect it shook off at least an infamous, if waning, habit. It was the first year, on record, that there was no lynching in the United States. The good word was reported last night by the Tuskegee Institute, the Negro college established by the state of Alabama in 1881, which has kept records of all lynchings and race riots since the year after its founding. In the intervening 70 years, only the 6 states of New England have never lynched anybody. 37 states have at some time or another lynched a Negro. But in this century, the annual incidence of lynching has declined steeply. In the last 10 years of the 19th century, the annual average was 154. From 1920 to 1930, it was 30, and 15 for the next 10 years. In 1945, 1947, and 1951, there was only 1 American death by lynching. The word, which has the strict meaning of illegal execution by a mob, has no proved origin. It has been variously derived from Lidford in England to the lynches of South Carolina. The writer and lexicographer H.L. Mencken says that the likeliest claim is that of Captain Charles Lynch of Virginia, a primeval 100% American who devoted himself to harassing Loyalists before and during the Revolution. By any other name, the practice of lynching got off to a brisk start during the sittings of the popular tribunals that looked for and found disloyalty to the new republic rampant throughout the victorious colonies. But lynching came to be thought of as a peculiar American institution during the period of westward expansion, when desperadoes of every sort preyed on the frail civil governments of the shifting western frontier. Yet it is not the righteous vigilantes of the West that come to mind when the word is mentioned. It is the Negro. And the record of lynchings since the late 1880s has been overwhelmingly the record of Negroes taken out of a local jail and hanged or shot by a mob for proved or alleged rape or homicide. 3/4 of the victims in the Tuskegee records have been Negroes, and since the numbers dwindled, more than 91% of them have been Negroes. The Institute, however, tempers its pride in the new record by warning about other patterns of violence that are replacing lynch law. The most marked since the last war is the practice of bombing private homes, especially where members of the Negro race have moved into what were considered white neighborhoods. Occasionally, the report says, the victims are Negro leaders who were thought to be too active in improving the status of their people. From the ghastly race riot in Detroit in 1943 to the bombing of a Negro's home in Florida last year, it is plain that the most inflammable places are urban areas where Negroes have spilled over districts traditionally inhabited by poor whites. The poorer the white, the tighter is the social tension when Negroes rent houses nearby. The day after the Detroit riot 9 years ago, I remember one shabby, raddled white man confessing in a corner saloon, "I may be low and poor, but I ain't as low as a nigger, not yet." It is a text for sociologists and housing experts, and little good will be done unless they discover some methods of easing the housing conditions of poor whites whose only hold on dignity is their pale face. President Eisenhower. Guardian, 20 January 1953. At 35 minutes after noon today in Washington, with grey winter skies rolling away before a warm winter sun, General of the Army Dwight D. Eisenhower was inaugurated as 34th President of the United States. He stood high on a rostrum before an encircling crowd on Capitol Hill, where the inauguration has always taken place since the burning of the Capitol by the British in 1812, which forced the ceremony out of doors. He stepped up with a solemn face to Chief Justice Fred Vinson, raised his right hand, kept his left hand on an open Bible, and repeated the oath, "I do solemnly swear that I, Dwight David Eisenhower, will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States, and will, to the best of my ability, preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States, so help me God." We have come a long way in public courtesy and public pomp since the first inauguration in Washington 152 years ago, when John Adams refused to accompany his successor to the Capitol and left Jefferson to ride up the hill alone, tie his horse to a fence, walk through the mud, go indoors, take the oath, and ride home again. This morning the General drove first to the White House, escorted by Senator Styles Bridges and Mr. Joseph Martin, the majority leaders of the Senate and the House, was received there by President Truman, bowed into the presidential car, and the two of them relaxed in the back seat and smiled and quipped together with all the memory of the master race and the bumbling, stumbling exchanges of the campaign forgotten. But whereas Jefferson had the consolations of his privacy, President Eisenhower and Mr. Truman, journeying to the Hill after the invention of the cathode tube, could not hide a whisper or a grimace from the 40 million families sitting as close as an oculist all the way from snowbound farms in Vermont to the beach houses of Southern California. Before the drive began, General Eisenhower looked ruddy but glum and a little restless. Mr. Truman grinned and chuckled and flashed his glasses. A shockingly uninformed stranger could have thought at first that the General was the defeated champ, and that this was the inauguration of Harry Truman. At 11:50 the cavalcade had swung up the noble avenue of Constitution Hill and arrived at the east portico of the Capitol, where the inauguration has been performed since 1829. Behind the stand the old and new dignitaries assembled and came down 2 by 2 to take their places. The diplomatic corps conforming to a man with the General's preference for a black Homburg, British Ambassador Sir Roger Makins at the end as the junior member. Then the new cabinet, Mr. John Foster Dulles, a quaintly old-fashioned figure in a big wing collar, and a grinning Charles Wilson, the only man not yet confirmed by a senatorial committee. After them, the 9 justices of the Supreme Court in their billowing gowns, and then the dispossessed, the Truman cabinet, led by an immaculate and stoic Dean Acheson. The Secret Service detail closed in on the procession, ushered the last stragglers to their seats, and the crowds coughed and settled down through a crisp selection by the United States Marine Corps Band. The Most Reverend Patrick O'Boyle, the Roman Catholic Archbishop of Washington, invoked a blessing on the august office of the presidency, indicated the path of rectitude for the framers of our laws, and hoped that justice may be made manifest in our judiciary. Then a small colored lady, the celebrated soprano, Miss Dorothy Maynor, sang the almost unsingable national anthem. Mr. Richard Nixon moved forward to receive the oath as Vice President, which he did with an intense solemnity. This was followed by a solo by a tenor from the Metropolitan Opera, a prayer by Rabbi Hillel Silver of Cleveland, and another bright burst by the Marine Band. It was time now for the translation of the General into a President. All through these preceding ceremonies he had stood immediately behind the parsons and the singers, his generous mouth immobile, his eyes down, visibly protecting his deepest feelings against the appalling challenge of this modern office to a candid man's humility. When the oath was taken, he gave his first smile, shook hands with the Chief Justice, crossed over to embrace his wife, shook hands with Vice President Nixon, moved to the microphone, and raised his arms high in his giant variation of the V for Victory sign. There was a quick round of applause, and then he began, asking first for the privilege of a personal prayer. He flexed his shoulders and started on an inaugural speech as somber as any since Franklin Roosevelt's first. Only 3 times did applause break in, not because the huge audience was laggard, but because it was intent. The first time was at the pledge to abhor appeasement, not to trade honor for security. The last time was at the assertion that the United States looks on all continents and peoples with equal regard and honor. The President stepped back at the end, an Episcopal bishop said the benediction, and the Marine Band piped and wheezed again at the national anthem. The President turned to his right, quickly shook the hand of the beaming Truman and the aging ex-President Herbert Hoover. Then everything relaxed. The President brought Mrs. Eisenhower, blooming with orchids, to the microphone. The band struck up the President's private march, Hail to the Chief. The clouds were skulking off to the horizon and the sun blazing. It was a mild Washington winter day, or a balmy summer's day at Old Trafford. The cathedral clock struck 1. On to lunch, with tramping elephants and swishing soldiers and twinkling girls and lumbering floats. Tonight at 10 there is not 1 inaugural ball, but 2, for 1 armory could never contain the dancing legions of the Republicans incarnate. Cancer and Smoking. Guardian, 20 February, 1954. For 30 years or more, the scandal sheets have printed articles on the tobacco habit, as a mild variation on their standard high-voltage treatment of such shockers as prostitution, political graft, and the traffic in dope. Most of these pieces, furtively hinting at heart trouble and even tuberculosis, were about as medically convincing as the Methodist credo that smoking stunts the growth. The tobacco companies paid only sidelong heed to them, with bold hints that, on the contrary, a cigarette was a relaxant, a soothing syrup, and a social grace. The manufacturers were not much better than the Puritans in their respect for the known scientific facts about tobacco, and have tended to meet every impromptu accusation with an equally flipped defense. In the social history of our time, it may well be that the Reader's Digest will come to claim a decisive part in dating the fashion of cigarette smoking. Although 3 separate reports were published here in 1949 suggesting a plausible relationship between smoking and cancer of the lung, they were folded away inside the pages of medical journals. But a year later, the Digest ran an article with the resounding title, Cancer by the Carton. This started a lot of talk in America, and a noticeable adjustment of cigarette advertising to remind the customer that the tobacco companies keep a 24-hour laboratory watch on every chemical intruder that might possibly sully his breath, tickle his throat, or otherwise impair his health and comfort. A few of the tobacco companies had in truth been financing quiet research, but it was concerned with heavier matters than a sore throat or an acrid taste. And since Americans went on buying cigarettes by leaping billions, the manufacturers maintained their code of contemptuous silence, which is almost as rigid as the taboo at a Victorian dinner table on the mention of the female leg. 2 years later, the British Medical Journal published a weightier study, and it began to look as if the cigarette manufacturers would never be shut of the nuisance. Last November, their long golden age, 20 years of continuously soaring sales, exploded in a bombshell prepared by Dr. Ernest Winder of New York and Dr. Evarts Graham of St. Louis. They reported that they had produced skin cancer in 44% of the mice they had painted with tobacco tar condensed from cigarette smoke. This study was hardly as comprehensive as the British study of nearly 1,500 human lung cancer patients, but it was piquant. It sprouted the joke, "It only goes to show mice shouldn't smoke." But the newspapers stood up and took notice in their heartless, disinterested way when the Institute of Industrial Medicine of this city, an incomparable branch of the New York Bellevue Medical Center, examined all the tumors reported in the Winder-Graham study and declared them to be malignant. Last 9 December, the papers carried the report of 2 speeches made by Dr. Winder and Dr. Alton Ochsner, Chief of Surgery at Tulane University School of Medicine, before a meeting of New York dentists. Dr. Winder quoted 13 American and foreign studies to conclude that the prolonged and heavy use of cigarettes increases up to 20 times the risk of developing cancer of the lung. Dr. Ochsner was bolder still. He foresaw that the male population of the United States might be decimated within 50 years by this type of cancer if cigarette smoking increases at its present rate. Within an hour of the opening of the stock exchange that day, big blocks of tobacco stocks were up for sale. One stock, which opened at 65 3/4, dropped to 62. Others lost between 2 and 3 points. By the first of this year, the horrid truth was out that the sale of cigarettes in the first 10 months of 1953 was off 2.1%. It seems a negligible fraction in the face of the triumphant record that in the past 20 years cigarette sales have gone up from 100,000 millions to over 400,000 millions. But nothing gets to feel so normal as unrelieved luxury, and a desperate tobacco executive reflected that if every American smoker used 1 cigarette less a day, our sales would drop by 5%. Which is to say 3 million packs a day, or an annual loss of $255.5 million. The makers of filter-tip cigarettes made a virtue of adversity, and came out celebrating the providential insight that had led them to manufacture a cigarette that filtered out all those menacing and, by implication, cancerous tars and fumes. Filtered cigarettes sold as many in 1953 as they had sold in the preceding 7 years. The dignified silence of the tobacco companies was broken. At last, some of them reluctantly confessed that for several years they had been subsidizing cancer research. Their advertising took on an almost testy tone of reassurance. But it was a reassurance about their concern for the health of the smoker, an apparent psychological blunder in that it insisted on the very context of disease from which they were consciously praying to be set free. The advertisers defend this reflection on interesting grounds. They say that their studies over many decades have shown a deep-seated public guilt about smoking, which has nothing to do with medical findings and everything to do with an old Puritan tradition, and which can best be allayed by a bedside manner, carefully sustained through what is already known to the trade as anxiety advertising. The way to restore the tobacco companies' phlegm and their prestige might be obvious to an Englishman: to combine in a huge donation for cancer research. It is not as easy in this country as in Britain. Whenever 2 manufacturers of the same product think to strengthen their case by joining forces, the shadow of the Sherman antitrust law falls across their best intentions. The tobacco companies are still wincing from the bruises of a famous antitrust suit of 1941, in which they were punished for an alleged conspiracy. However, they have appealed for help to the middlemen, the tobacco distributors. who have taken the risk of forming a tobacco industry research committee to finance an independent study of lung cancer. Meanwhile, the medical profession is going ahead on its own. The Institute of Industrial Medicine means to break down tobacco tars into their component parts and hopes to discover which fraction caused the skin cancer in mice. This ambition is evidently so beset with chemical and biological problems that it has taken almost a year to build and set up the necessary equipment. Standing apart from all the interested parties who would seek to prejudice the truth by arraying the doctors against the manufacturers, there is one odd and important figure, a man possessed of a Voltairean disdain. He is Dr. Kyler Hammond, the American Cancer Society's chief medical statistician. He has deep doubts about all the studies reported so far. He suspects that the interviewers of lung cancer patients probably induce an emotional bias in their victims, who will thereby be led to make suspicious confessionals of heavy smoking. He says that it is extremely difficult to find a control group with the matched characteristics of age, social standing, occupational habits, and regional location of any given sick group. He warns against the false premise that might be exposed to prove only that smokers produce earlier symptoms rather than more cancer. He suggests that even if there were no significant association between smoking and cancer in the general population, a telling one might be found in the hospital population. He is even sour about the claims of the filter-tipped cigarettes, remarking in his wry way that the carbon in tobacco smoke probably neutralizes some toxic agents, and that if the filter removes those carbon particles, filter cigarettes would do more harm than good. Dr. Hammond is an ominous figure in this whole controversy, because he happens to be conducting, on behalf of the American Cancer Society, the most exhaustive study yet attempted. He began in January 1952, composing a staff of interviewers who will study the life histories of 204,000 healthy white men between the ages of 50 and 69, who together form a statistical sample of the American white male population. Their smoking habits in particular are being punched up on the bewildering file cards of the International Business Machines Company. Whenever a man dies, his clinical history is recorded, and any cancer history traced and studied. The study will not end until the whole 200,000 are dead, but Dr. Hammond says he will have the first significant findings ready by the end of 1955. One leading cigarette company has already said that it will accept the results as unquestioned. What Sir Walter Raleigh began, Dr. Kyler Hammond may either end or set free for a new lease of life. Revulsion against McCarthy. Guardian, 12 June 1954. Senator Joseph McCarthy was all over the front pages again this morning, but the instinct that put him there was for once not his. It looked as if, finally, an impulse of moral revulsion had galvanized the country and braced the backbone of an incongruous variety of his victims. The Department of the Army, a middle-aged colored woman, the spectators at a session of the Senate's Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations, 2 Democratic senators, and a suddenly blithe host of columnists and radio critics were moved to furious protest at the senator's tactics and his stature. The Army published a long report that documented in shocking detail the threats of the young Mr. Roy Cohn, McCarthy's chief counsel, to wreck the Army and break Secretary Robert Stevens if David Shine, a McCarthy investigator, was not given consistently preferential treatment after he had been drafted into the Army as a private. The report told how Senator McCarthy had directly approached the Army's chief legal counsel to seek a commission for Private Shine, how the Army found him unqualified to receive one, how Senator McCarthy and Mr. Cone then demanded that Shine be assigned to New York in order to study evidence of pro-communist leanings in West Point textbooks, and how this request was also refused. How, when the Army told Mr. Cone that after Private Shine had finished his basic training, the chances were 9 to 1 that he would be sent overseas, this provoked in Mr. Cone the threat to wreck the Army and make sure that Mr. Stevens would be through as Secretary of the Army. The Army insisted at one point that a policy of special treatment for any Army private was not in the national interest, whereupon Mr. Cone, who is all of 27, told the Army he would give it a little national interest by showing it up in public in its worst light. The report listed the many occasions on which Private Shine was given special passes to come to New York, supposedly on the subcommittee's business. Last December, the commanding general of his camp complained to the Army's legal counsel that Private Shine was becoming increasingly difficult because the soldier was leaving the spot nearly every night, and usually returning very late at night. The day after this warning, Senator McCarthy told the Army that he was no longer interested in having special treatment for Private Shine. But apparently Mr. Cone was furious and told the Army's counsel that he would show him what it meant to go over his head. 6 weeks later, the battle to have Private Shine assigned to New York was still going on, and Senator McCarthy warned the Army's counsel of the consequences of thwarting young Mr. Cone. 2 weeks later, Senator McCarthy told an assistant to telephone the Army's counsel that he was very angry about the honorable discharge granted to a New York dentist who had claimed his privilege not to answer questions about past associations. 10 days after that, General Swicker, the commanding officer of the dentist's former Army camp, was called to testify before the McCarthy subcommittee. And that, as all the world now knows, was the guerrilla episode that led to the famous Memorandum of Understanding, or, as some say, the terms of surrender, between the Army of the United States and Senator McCarthy. Inevitably, there was standing room only in Washington yesterday when the subcommittee called Mrs. Annie Lee Moss, a middle-aged colored woman who was suspended by the Army Signal Corps after Senator McCarthy had described her as a code clerk whose communist record was known to the Army. Mrs. Moss was a cafeteria worker who quietly told the subcommittee yesterday that she had never been in a code room in her life. Mr. Cone tried to establish her personal connection with a staff member of the Daily Worker, but it turned out that the man she knew was a colored man who happened to have the same name. The audience was uncommonly ready with applause for Democratic committee members and Mrs. Moss's lawyer whenever they protested at the tactics of Mr. Cone. At one point, Senator Stuart Symington, Democrat of Missouri, asked if she knew who Karl Marx was. "Who's that?" she gravely asked, and the crowd laughed itself silly. When she finished her testimony and stepped down from the stand, Senator Symington leaned into his microphone and angrily cried, "I may be sticking my neck out, but I think you are telling the truth. And if you're not taken back in your Army job, you come around and see me. I am going to see that you get a job." Senator McCarthy was mercifully absent from these rebellious proceedings because he was busy composing a broadcast reply to Adlai Stevenson's condemnation of him at Miami last Saturday, to the first outright attack made on him by a Republican senator, Ralph Flanders of Vermont, and to a trenchant analysis of his methods televised to a national audience last Tuesday night by the celebrated American commentator Edward R. Murrow, and sponsored by the Aluminum Company of America. Senator Flanders on Tuesday vindicated the honor of the Republican Party on the floor of the Senate by suddenly putting the rhetorical question, "What party does he belong to?" One must conclude that his is a one-man party, and that its name is McCarthyism, a title which he has proudly accepted. Senator Flanders then launched into the first open attack on McCarthy by a Republican in this session of Congress. He said that McCarthy was diverting the attention of the nation away from dangerous problems abroad, and that he was doing his best, by intention or through ignorance, to shatter the Republican Party. Next day, President Eisenhower sent a letter of commendation to Senator Flanders and told his news conference that the senator had done the country a service by calling attention to the danger of us engaging in internecine warfare and magnifying certain items of procedure and right and personal aggrandizement. But it may be that the spark that set off this fiery and so righteous explosion of popular indignation was laid with deliberate courage by Mr. Murrow. He came to great fame in America during the war through his broadcasts from London. He is a tireless news reporter, and in his weekly television dramatization of the news, a consummate showman. Last Tuesday night, Mr. Murrow gave over his whole half-hour to a pictorial analysis of McCarthyism, by projecting visual excerpts from the senator's speeches and sessions of his subcommittee. It was McCarthy exposed by McCarthy, and Mr. Murrow added only the sparest narrative comment. But at the end, after the huge audience for this program had seen McCarthy merciless, McCarthy jocular, McCarthy cunning, McCarthy sentimental, Mr. Murrow looked his audience in the eye and ended with these words: "This is no time for men who oppose Senator McCarthy's methods to keep silent, or for those who approve. We can deny our heritage and our history, but we cannot escape responsibility for the result. There is no way for a citizen of the Republic to abdicate his responsibilities. As a nation, we have come into our full inheritance at an early age. We proclaim ourselves, as indeed we are, the defenders of the free world, or what's left of it. We cannot defend freedom abroad by deserting it at home." The actions of the junior senator from Wisconsin have caused alarm and dismay among our allies abroad and given comfort to our enemies. And whose fault is that? Not really his. He didn't create the situation of fear, merely exploited it, and skillfully. Cassius was right. The fault, dear Brutus, is not in our stars, but in ourselves. These words were spoken with the blessing of the Aluminum Company of America, which has obviously a lot to lose by taking this stand. The response, however, of televiewers across the country has been a stunning endorsement of Mr. Murrow. So far, the comments, by telephone, telegram, and letter, are running about 15-1 in his favor. Hence, the surprising rally of candor in public men who have stayed astutely silent for 3 years. Hence President Eisenhower's relieved approval of Senator Flanders. Hence a mourning chorus of suddenly uninhibited newspaper columnists praising Murrow for laying it on the line. Hence the confident laughter of the big audience at yesterday's subcommittee hearing. Hence the delayed righteousness of Senator Symington of Missouri. Mr. Murrow may yet make bravery fashionable. Bikini Island Detonation. Letter number 358, 1 April 1954. With the promise of spring and the first warm wind from the west, there came also, this last week, the shattering explosion from Bikini. It would be false and mischievous to say that the American people have responded in gloom or panic. I can't tell you what the American people feel, because I don't know how anybody, short of the Almighty, can be in touch with the feelings of a whole nation. But I ought to say that in my own observation, frivolous people are still frivolous, optimistic people remain optimistic, and serious people are shaken. I think the situation is very much the way it was the morning after the first atomic bomb was dropped on Japan. It was surely not heartlessness that made people grateful for a sign that the end of the war was in sight, rather than to be depressed by the horrible thought of the first atomic victims. It was much too early then to take in the human and political consequences of this first triumph of nuclear fission. People wanted to know how it worked, as they did after the first steam engine took to the tracks, or Lindbergh's airplane had crossed the Atlantic, and the papers were there to help them. Those were the days, you may recall, when for a month or two almost every paper and magazine that you picked up had little geometric diagrams of arrows shooting at what looked like ping-pong balls. And when the great cliché of our time was invented, the mushroom-shaped cloud. At the moment, people are a little too dazed to attempt the feat of imagination required to picture an explosion 700 times as powerful as the one that devastated Hiroshima. It is breaking no confidences to say that the scientists and military men who were at Bikini on the 1st of March were themselves surprised to see and feel a detonation that was 2 or 3 times more powerful than anything they had expected. The Atomic Energy Commission, which usually after these tests puts out a frank and concise report of what happened, was remarkably cryptic. It merely acknowledged in an almost casual way that some sort of weapon or device had been tested in its proving grounds in the South Pacific. It's clear enough now, I think, that all the people engaged in the test were sworn after it happened to even deeper secrecy, and that nothing would have been published for a long time until the President had been able to brief his advisers and probably have confidential contacts with the British government. For it must have been clear in the early days of last month that we, meaning the human race, had come to a crisis in the history of war and peace. This conclusion is now available to all of us because of the bizarre accident, and apparently it was a really unhappy freak, that suddenly deposited a cloud of radioactive ash on the boat of those Japanese fishermen. I hope it doesn't sound too cruel to say that their misfortune brought out into the open a new and tremendous problem in human history. When I said that serious people were shaken by the new H-bomb, I didn't mean merely that they are aware, for the first time since we made an atom bomb, that perhaps we shall have to scrap all our accumulated skill in warfare and our entire understanding of what can constitute any sort of world society that can survive. This is obviously a turning point in history that cannot be shrugged off or pacified with appeals to decent feeling. And it might seem at the moment that nothing is more useless than off-hand optimism. But I know people who are, to say the least, wise in the knowledge of atomic energy, who have had a good deal to do with its technical development and political management since the war, who are inclined to think that the Bikini H-bomb could be one of the best things that ever happened to us. They argue from such simple analogy that, say for instance, there was no way to stop reckless motorists from injuring one another inside big cities until there were enough cars on the street to force the invention of traffic lights. This simple invention managed to discipline the hopeless variety of human character in the stated cause of convenience, but actually in the service of safety. Look around you next time your bus stops at a traffic light, and look at the faces of the people driving trucks and cars who automatically consent to wait for 20 or 30 seconds. You see scatterbrained people, genial people, mean people, impatient and aggressive people. But after a quarter of a century, they all accept the dictates of a green light turning to red. And when that engineer in New Haven, Connecticut, first took his invention to the patent office shortly after the First World War, he was told by the best engineers and lawyers that although it was mechanically ingenious, it overlooked the incurable tendency of human beings to push weaker people to the wall. He was told it wouldn't work, and the poor man was forced, in the next 5 years, to become a crusader. He didn't die until 1939, by which time he was living high up on Riverside Drive in New York, and had the satisfaction of looking down on swift streams of traffic running north and south on 2 sweeping levels of the riverbank. If he had ever cared to stop a few motorists and ask then if they thought traffic signals should be abolished, they obviously would have thought the man mad. Well, I'm sure to some people this will all sound very trivial and foolish, but some of the most profound physical laws of our universe were discovered by equally humble moments of insight. The law of gravity, for instance, to say nothing of the first groping after atomic energy itself. Could it not be that we might all become compelled to obey a moral law by the discovery of a home truth? What keeps showy and sadistic people from rushing through traffic lights is not the prospect of damaging somebody else's car or body, but the thought of damaging their own. And it may be that Bikini has proved beyond a doubt that the time interval between the extermination of the country attacked and the country attacking could be about 2 hours. We have had, from the Kremlin, for the first time, an admission by a Soviet premier that a Third World War would be the end of everything. We don't have to take this as an agreeable and spontaneous change of heart in the power that has threatened and harassed the Western world for the last 7 years at least. The Bikini bomb may have proved to the most ruthless governments that the new law of peace is safety first. In fact, the only profoundly gloomy note I have heard from a responsible man was the remark of a former atom scientist that the most depressing news of the century would be the discovery of a reliable defense against the H-bomb. The Untraveled Road, Montgomery, Alabama. Guardian, 7 June 1956. 20 years ago, the interest of anyone coming from England in the southern back country was with the music, the vernacular, and the general pathos of the Negro. On any blinding summer afternoon, he could come on a fat-coloured wench pausing from the chore of cotton-picking to throw her head high at the sun and whine, "Go down, old Hannah, don't you rise no more." In the scruffy parts of towns, he would sit deeply satisfied in dark corners of saloons, while bent-over pianists beat out the immortal 12 bars of the blues. If he was lucky, he could go down to Storyville in New Orleans at sundown and hear half-naked slatterns reduce their lot to poetry by crooning from behind the swinging door of their cribs, "I ain't good-lookin', and my hair ain't curled, but my mother taught me somethin' gonna carry me through this world." His interest was rarely political in those days, for the New Deal had conveniently shouldered the burden of the poor. There was the Civilian Conservation Corps for shiftless boys, the Works Progress Administration for idle hands of any colour, the government's promise of the more abundant life for all who were heavy-laden. When the poor had cried, Roosevelt had wept. It was a very satisfactory state of things for those who, having an English background, were artistic connoisseurs of someone else's tragedy. The New Deal was, if we had had the gumption to see it, a menace to this attractive view of the lowly. On his next visit to New Orleans, he was apt to find the whores' cribs destroyed, the last transoms of the old sporting houses all pulled down, Basin Street itself turned into a housing project. Today his motives would be quite different for seeking out Montgomery's dark town. 20 years ago he accepted the white and colored signs everywhere as a natural distinction that even Roosevelt would not change. Today he would be here to see how it was with an embattled city whose whites, mobilized in a citizens' council 15,000 strong, were sworn to resist the Supreme Court's order to abolish these distinctions, to send children of any color to school together, to allow a Negro to sit where he will on a bus or a train. The Negroes of Montgomery were now in the 5th month of their boycott of the city's buses. Useless for the bus company to heed a circuit court ruling in South Carolina and order its drivers to seat all passengers as equals. The city commission forbade the change, and the Negroes were enjoying their martyrdom too much to accept a victory by compromise. Some of them walked to work, as to the Crusades. Most were picked up by carpools. When they were downhearted, the militant faithful swarmed, so I heard, to the Mount Zion African Methodist Episcopal Church on Holt Street, to be fortified by the words of 35 colored pastors, most of all by their leader, the Reverend Martin Luther King, Jr. So I pushed open the doors of the railway station, white waiting room, and hailed a cab and gave the address, 657 South Holt. The driver dropped me off 2 blocks away, just so you won't be too conspicuous. And when I turned into this frowsy street, I heard the blues again. They were coming in spurts from the jukeboxes of small saloons and lunch counters. Then one of the screen doors would slam back on its springs again and muffle the licentiousness within. Even at the church, the rhythm of it hung on the air, softened and slowed by religious ardor, no doubt, yet the same minor chords and the same heaving melancholy. It came from 500 or 600 people, blacker than the night around them, sitting forward with their hands bunched on their knees. They made little movement, and were the best-dressed Methodist audience it has ever been my lot to see. But they were joined in God by memories of long ago, when they wore no clothes at all. Far off, under a brown-painted Gothic window, a sister was testifying, standing and improvising a prayer in many a King James sentence changed through the uvula in strangulated quarter tones. She went on as long as the Spirit moved her, and then a man near me got up and cried, "O Lord, O Lord, stay close at hand when my time has come." Between each solo phrase and incantation, the congregation surged in with a mass humming of the 4 classic chords of the blues, the devil's music. This went on for over an hour before Old-Time Religion was sung as a battle cry, and there was a rustle of people at a side door, and the leaders came out, the Reverend Sims, the Reverend Hayes, the Reverend Powell. The Reverend Sims appealed for steadiness in traveling this untraveled road. To put it bluntly, they needed more drivers. The Reverend Powell counseled patience, for you can't hurry God. There was many an obedient "yah" at this. But when they were told that station wagons had been brought from out of town and would soon be coming in, they let out a salvo of applause, and when the Reverend King came forward, it was like the relief of Mafeking. The leaders, he said with solemnity, had written a constitution for the cause, and he would now submit it to them. He took it in his hand and read it aloud. So far, the only English we had heard had come from the source and textbook of all their peace on earth, from the Bible itself, doubtless the only book that many of them had ever read. Now we were to hear from the Reverend King, an educated man. This great movement had started, he said, without the external and internal attachments in terms of organizational structure. They listened in awe. If they or their children came to be integrated, they too could get to write like this. The Reverend King was indeed a master of Pentagon or federal prose, and the Constitution was written almost wholly in it. It was implemented with 8 committees, staffed by the leaders, and was heady with executive boards, trustees, public relations committees, provisions for tenure of office, just like General Motors. Its first article was a declaration to ensure respect for the dignity of the individual with respect to transportation. This document was heard in a marveling silence, and when he had finished, the Reverend King hardly paused for a moved and a seconded to declare the Constitution received, approved, and adopted. Though there had been some violence after the first of these rallies, and a couple of coloured homes burned, the whites now accept them like revival meetings. Before the first one, in December, Mr. Bagley, the bus company's manager, was warned to dissuade his son, a war veteran, from opening up a gas station on the edge of Darktown. Mr. Bagley, on the contrary, cornered a coloured friend and suggested that the Reverend King might announce the new ownership in the middle of the rally. So he did, and the Negroes rolled off in droves afterward to christen the new pump. 80% of young Bagley's business today is from coloured folk filling up their tanks to maintain the boycott of his father's buses. Such is the temper of the fight between the resigned whites and the sassy Negroes of Montgomery, Alabama. With a final prayer and a rolling hymn, this meeting broke up in ecstasy and good order. I was off down the street as the congregation rose, and a saloon door swung open and let out 2 Negroes. "You going back home now, boy?" "Why, sure," shouted the other, walking fast. "My old lady weighs 280 pounds. Man, that's an awful lot of woman." He cackled insanely, and the bad people went on dancing the blues inside the seedy saloons. And the good people came down the church steps and went home to bed to strengthen themselves against an early rising, the smooth running of the carpools, the determination never to faint or yield in upholding the Reverend King, staying off the buses, and so giving glory to God. Humphrey Bogart, 1900 to 1957. Guardian, 16 January 1957. 30 years ago, toward the end of the first act of one of those footling country house comedies that passed in the 1920s for social satire, a juvenile in an ascot and a blue blazer loped through the French windows and tossed off the immortal invitation, "Tennis, anyone?" Possibly he did not coin the phrase, but he glorified the type, if wooden young men with brown eyes and no discoverable occupation can ever be said to go to glory, on stage or off. This young man, whose performance the critic Alexander Woolcott said could be mercifully described as inadequate, yet seemed to be cast by fortune for the role of a Riviera fixture. He was the son of a prominent New York doctor. His mother was a portrait painter of socialite children. He himself dawdled a while at one of the better private schools, and was intended for Yale. Intended, but never ready. 20 years later, he coined another phrase with which the small fry of the English-speaking world brought neighborhood sneaks to heel. "Drop the gun, Louis." Could both these characters be Humphrey Bogart, the cryptic Hemingway tough, the man in the trench coat who singed the bad and beautiful with the smoke he exhaled from his nostrils? They could. Could any actor, no matter how lucky in his parts, how wild the gamut of his ambitions, swing so successfully between the poles of make-believe represented by "Tennis, anyone?" and "Drop the gun, Louis"? He could, and did. He was always content to nestle in the camouflage of any fictional type, provided studios paid him and left him to himself. A very complex man, gentle at bottom and afraid to seem so. It is fair to guess that far back in the era of dramatist Frederick Lonsdale, he was always his own man. He no doubt stood in the wings, in his blazer, chuckling acidly over the asininities on stage, just as he lately complained that he could not walk the streets of New York without having truck drivers and corner brats spring their forefingers and give him the Tommy gun treatment. On Fifth Avenue, 2 years ago, a wholesome young cop, testing shop doors at 2 in the morning, moved up on him from behind. "Everything all right, Mr. Bogart?" Everything was fine, and Bogey sighed after him, "It does no good. I haven't played a gangster or a dick in 9 years." But this was his most famous self, the two-faced cynic who robbed the banker and the gangster with equal grace, who was sometimes a heel and sometimes a big city stand-in for the United States Cavalry, but who was always the derisive foe of the law in its official forms. And this character was suddenly precious in the age of violence, for it satisfied a rather desperate need of the engulfed ordinary man. When Hitler was acting out scripts more brutal and obscene than anything dreamed of by Chicago or Warner Brothers, Bogart was the only possible idealist likely to outwit him and survive. No Ronald Colman, Leslie Howard, or other handsome Boy Scout, but a conniver as subtle as Goebbels, a very tough gent who in the end was on our side. The enjoyment of this character from Glasgow to Singapore was assured by the supporting artistic fact that here was a universal type of our rebellious age, but one that never appeared in life quite so perfect, never quite so detached in its malice, so inured to corruption, so self-assured in its social stance before the diffident, the pompous, and the evil. It would be tempting, and the French will be tempted, to write off the Bogart character as the archetype of the outsider. But he packed, in fact, the more explosive social threat of the insider gone sour. He was, in short, a romantic hero, inconceivable in any time but ours. The way he came to achieve this character and its renown is a pretty irony, and he himself put it all down to luck. Bogart was just as old as the century, and by the mid-30s he was getting to be a little too scarred for a juvenile. He would undoubtedly have faded into the kind of feature player who never stars and makes a compensating fuss about the size of his name in lights. Playwright Robert Sherwood had written The Petrified Forest, and was looking around for what would now be called an offbeat piece of casting for the part of the listless killer Duke Mantee. Against the advice of his friends, who remembered Bogart from his tennis racketeering, Sherwood picked the aging juvenile with the scar, the odd lisp, and the look of implied derision. He was an instant star, and was soon whipped out to Hollywood for the movie version, and that led straight to Dead End and the Glory Road. It proved again what actors rarely admit, that the stars in their courses are nearly always set by the casting directors. A new view of an old face was all it took to change Wallace Beery from a slant-eyed villain into a lovable cuss, to turn Myrna Loy from an inscrutable, as the word is understood in Oriental melodramas, into a chin-up wife for William Powell, himself transformed by the same insight from a gunman into a teasing combination of smooth operator and faithful spouse. Soon the word got back east from Hollywood that Bogart was living out his screen character in a running series of marital brawls. The battling Bogart, the columnists called him when his divorce came up. Battling Bogart, groaned his oldest theatrical friend Clifton Webb, recalling a few weeks ago the shock of this fantasy. Why, any woman could walk all over him. The man's a softy, and, I might add, reflecting on the last and ghastly year of Bogart's illness, a very gallant one. This true remark points to yet another offbeat rule, that no producer had the wit to discover the character of Humphrey Bogart himself. Only once, in Casablanca, did the audience see a decent approximation to the unfooled man whose wryness was the mask of an incorruptibility he mocked. He drank and blasphemed and tolerated, even fattened, the newspaper image of a locker-room tough guy. But sometimes the hard shell cracked. He advised young actors to take the big part, but hold off on the big house and the Cadillac, or you'll be the studio's slave. The only point in making money, he said, was so you can tell some big shot to go to hell. When the McCarthy era was incubating in the congressional hearings on the Hollywood 10, he recklessly flew to Washington to defend their right to think and say anything they damn please. When it was murmured by the studio heads in 1952 that an open embrace of Adlai Stevenson might weaken the bonds of a contract, Bogart and his wife, a female chip off the same species, packed their bags and toured with the Stevenson campaign train. They bowed in small New England towns at all hours and ducked out on the observation platform only when they were asked. They openly scoffed at the presidential fitness of the big general. Bogart was scoffing when he died. These were chance cracks in the armor plate he built around his integrity, a word he would have scorned to use. He invented the Bogart character, and it fitted his deceptive purpose like a glove. By showily neglecting his outward forms of grace, he kept inferior men at a distance, for he lived in a town crowded by malign poseurs, fake ascetics, studio pandas, the pimps of the press. From all of them he was determined to keep his secret, the rather shameful secret, in the realistic world we inhabit, of being a gallant man and an idealist. The USA versus the State of Arkansas. Guardian, 5 September, 1957. The 9 young Negroes of Little Rock, Arkansas, who tried yesterday to obey the orders of a federal court by attending a white high school picked for them by their own school board, were politely turned away by state militiamen carrying rifles under the command of a full major general. Today, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People advised them not to go back for a while, and none of them turned up today to enjoy their right, under the Constitution, of being jeered and spat at by an early crowd of 500 white cretins. Overnight, the governor of the state, the intrepid Orval Forbes, assured himself the safety of his rest by ringing his mansion with another detachment of militiamen. Nobody at all, according to the exasperated mayor of Little Rock, was endangering the life of the governor, or even posing a threat to law and order sufficient to justify calling out the state guard. in a situation that, he avowed around midnight, grows more explosive by the hour. He had heard correctly earlier in the day that the federal judge who ordered the schools of Little Rock to integrate white and colored children had appealed to Attorney General Herbert Brownell for help, and that the prompt response was to send FBI agents to investigate the morning's uproar outside the school and to determine who was threatening whom. The governor suspected that the FBI men might decide that in calling out the militia to resist a federal court order, the governor might be guilty of contempt, a crime that provides, in the Civil Rights Bill the President will sign today or tomorrow, for federal punishment through the new Civil Rights Division of the Department of Justice. The governor was even alerted to the rumor that the FBI men were on their way to lasso and transport him to the nearest jail. Yet other fears besieged him. He confided to the President, in a midnight telegram that was at once given to the news services, that he had reason to believe the telephone lines to the governor's mansion were being tapped by the FBI men. A great waste of diligence, since wiretapped evidence is inadmissible in the federal courts. However, a Southern governor instructed against his deepest instincts to betray the Southern way of life cannot be too careful. Last night, Governor Forbes called for the protection of his palace guard, and another detachment of the state militia, equipped with rifles, guns, and jeeps, ringed the executive mansion to protect his uneasy rest. The motion before the court is a teasing one. Indeed, it has not before come up in this acute form during the 3.5 years since the United States Supreme Court threw down its ultimatum to the South and provoked the Civil Rights War. The question is this: when is a sovereign state in a federal system, and on whose troops may it call to defend itself against the federal government? In the foregoing paragraphs, the words militiamen and state guard may look at first glance like colorful euphemisms for the United States Army. They are, however, precisely used, and signify a body of troops the like of which is on reserve in all the 48 states, whose first allegiance is to their commander-in-chief, the governor. The situation grows murky, but necessarily so, when it is explained that the State Guard of Arkansas is recruited from the National Guard, the state's reserve of volunteers on whom the federal government has first call. After a Pearl Harbor, the United States may mobilize the National Guard in all the states, and the men of Arkansas, who so gallantly defended 300 white citizens against the immobile force of 9 Negroes, would, in a national crisis, put on their federal caps. To protect law and order within their own state borders, they hurry, at the governor's discretion, to put on their state caps. They were acting, Governor Forbes contends, as the State Guard, the duly constituted relics of the old colonial Minutemen, whose first duty was the defense of their homes and sacred honor against marauders from other states or fifth columnists. But the Department of Justice may dispute the status of the Arkansas State Guard. Its equipment is supplied by the federal government, to the tune, in the last fiscal year, of $5.5 million. A sum innocently contributed by taxpayers in Massachusetts, California, and New York, among other places, who hardly expected it would be used by Arkansas to defy the federal government. A Democratic Senator, Richard Neuberger of Oregon, has not hesitated to judge the governor of Arkansas as a man using federal money and arms to equip his own state in a pitched battle against the federal courts. Senator Neuberger shot off a telegram to the Defense Department and publicly wondered if it is advisable, from the standpoint of public policy or within the law, for such contributions to continue if the Arkansas National Guard is to be an instrument used for avoidance of complying with an order of the federal district court. The governor is within his rights, however, in saying that it's for him to define the nature of a threat to the peace. He admits that he instructed the troops to forbid the colored children to go to the school the federal government had ordered them to attend. He is, no question, wholeheartedly against integration, but his legal stand is taken on his judgment that an attempt to enforce the federal order on the first or second day of the school year would have caused rioting and bloodshed. So, he says, he summoned the National Guard, or the State Guard, whichever way you care to label it, to keep order. That is his privilege under the law and the Constitution, which precisely says that the authority of the United States may move into a state to secure it against domestic violence only when the state legislature asks for it, or if the lawmakers are in recess, when the governor himself appeals for it. What has happened in Little Rock is that the governor has called on his own state guard to fulfill their legal function in a threat to law and order that is provoked by command of the federal government. If the federal government ordered the firstborn of Arkansas to be drowned in the Mississippi, the governor would no doubt call on his state troops and their national equipment to resist the ruling. Who would then be the outlaw? The Founding Fathers, in their wisdom, actually anticipated such a Herodian aberration and supported the sovereign right of self-defense of any state so cruelly instructed. Unhappily, they did not foresee the day when the authority of the United States would be vested in 9 colored children on their way to school, and the resistance to it would come from the standing army of the state. Castro in control of Cuba. Guardian, 3 January 1959. Castro today chose his birthplace, Santiago de Cuba, as provisional capital until such time as he could safely install in the presidential palace at Havana the man he has proclaimed provisional president. He is Manuel Urrutia Leo, a 58-year-old judge unknown to fame until, after 31 years on the bench, he faced last year 150 youths charged with inciting to revolt. He set them free on the brave principle that the Batista government had left Cubans no other means to defend their constitutional rights. He became a revolutionary hero, and today he has his reward. His first act was to declare a general strike so as to curb the rioting and to demonstrate through the patrols of the revolutionary militia that Castro is indeed the government in fact. The Batista government and most of its lackeys are already in the United States, or in one of several Caribbean havens. A plane load of 92 of them landed at New York's Idlewild Airport last night, and a Cuban merchant ship sailed for the Dominican Republic, where Fulgencio Batista is safe in the embrace of his former ward and enemy, the dictator Rafael Trujillo. The last act of Batista's abortive junta was to tell the government troops to lay down their arms. They appear to have done so, but Castro broadcast today an order to his forces everywhere to go armed and fire on sight at all looters, agitators, and pockets of resistance. Most Cubans, and certainly the onlooking dictators of Nicaragua, Paraguay, Haiti, and the Dominican Republic, find it hard to believe that Batista's domain could be conquered by an angry, though wealthy young man whose first putsch against the island on the 1st of December 1956 left him with only 12 of the original force of 93 men. Castro may doubt it too, but he is taking no chances. The mob, which yesterday tooted and rejoiced through the streets, betrayed him in an outbreak of pillage and rioting. This morning the streets of Havana were reported to be empty, except for the Castro patrols cruising in the cars that were chasing them only 2 days ago. But by midday, a radio dispatch said that the city was taking on again a dangerously lively air. Units of rebel militia were ordered to the Manzana de Gomez block of buildings, where groups of followers of Senator Rolando Masferrer, a leading Batista supporter, were hiding. Fighting went on for 2 hours, watched by crowds of spectators. Today, in Ciudad Trujillo, Batista admitted the absurdity of his rout by an amateur, but said that the first men sent to wipe out the rebels were soldiers of the Rural Guard who were not prepared for guerrilla warfare. When the rebels extended their operations and met the army in open battle, they were well armed, and their weapons were superior to ours. The last excuse is doubted by Latin American experts and businessmen who say that up to the end Batista was receiving planes and arms from big powers. What doomed him, they agree, was the treachery of his own leaders, widespread desertions in the army, and the final dash for safety of men bound to him only by bribery. Late this afternoon, one of Castro's lieutenants took over the Havana remnants of this faithless army and passed the cue to Castro to begin his triumphal entry into the capital city. If he subdues it without much bloodshed, he must quickly repair the heavy damage to the railroads, highways, and sugar farms in 3 provinces, set the economy flowing again, and keep the people quiet until he can arrange free elections. Then he must answer the question that confronts all resting heroes who have raised their flags in the capital and put the tyrants to flight. How free dare the elections be? Castro has advertised an elaborate and drastic socialist program. He proposes to nationalize all utilities, to give their working land to tenant farmers, who make up 85% of the farming population, to distribute to the employees of every business in Cuba 30% of the profits, to confiscate all the property of corrupt, i.e., former government officials, to modernize the island's industries and begin a huge rural housing and electrification project. In a country where army officers on the winning side instantly inherit palaces, where there is little experience of parliamentary government, and where the idea of a loyal opposition is tantamount to treason, Castro may, like others before him, come to demand a rubber stamp and permit only token opposition. At the moment, though, all is joy and glory. The liberals among the South Americans in the United Nations are toasting the great day and calculating the present arithmetic of tyranny in Latin America. The present score seems to be, as one man put it, 4 down and 4 to go. Hawaii, the 50th state. Guardian, 13 March 1959. At least 1 year ahead of its rosiest hope, and 56 years after its first plea to Washington, Hawaii yesterday became the 50th of the United States of America. The Act of Congress, released to the Senate in a flash on Wednesday and passed by nightfall, and by the House yesterday afternoon, defines the new state as the islands of Hawaii proper and 17 outlying islands and appurtenant reefs. It does not include the Midway Islands, Johnston Island, or Kingman Reef. President Eisenhower was delighted to hear the news and will sign the bill as soon as he gets it. At about 2:45 yesterday afternoon, a loose-limbed young man in his late 30s stood in the office of Speaker of the House, Sam Rayburn, keeping one ear pinned to a telephone linked with Honolulu and the other ear cocked for the droning baritone of the Clerk of the House, who was chanting the roll call. The young man was William Quinn, Hawaii's appointed governor, and he was waiting for the 219th aye, which would pass the bill beyond recall. As soon as he heard it, he shouted to his deputy, 5,090 miles away, "Okay, Ed, sound the sirens, close the schools, and get going." A police car siren went off like a V-2 rocket, and within the half-hour the Hawaiian Islands were pealing more bells than have been heard since the Edgar Allan Poe centenary. The small but vigilant Hawaiian lobby in Washington broke out a crate of lays, and by this morning it was hard to find a television announcer or a quiz kid without a garland. The acting governor of Hawaii shut all the schools in the island chain until Monday, and hinted at a year-long celebration. But between the orgy and the fact it celebrates falls the shadow of procedure, which was long enough to keep Alaska out of the Union for 6 months after Congress passed its statehood bill. Hawaii must hold a primary to approve the bill, not earlier than 60 days after the President has signed it. The present governor may then proclaim a general election to follow within 40 days, at which the people will pick 2 U.S. senators, 1 congressman, a governor, and a state legislature. Within another statutory period, the results must be certified to the President of the United States, who can then proclaim the entry of the new state. All this is expected to take till midsummer. There seems no chance that Hawaii could telescope these formalities and add its star on the 49-star flag that will be unfurled on the 4th of July to celebrate the admission of Alaska. Unless this is done, Hawaii will have to wait till Independence Day 1960 to appear in the 50-star flag, which must now become the true official American flag. This red tape, a mere nuisance to legislators and impatient patriots, is a Laocoon coil to Mr. Digby Chandler, the president of Annin and Company, Fifth Avenue, chief flagmakers to the Republic. After a dreadful battle with congressmen and other non-aesthetes, Mr. Chandler got the approval of the Presidential Flag Commission for a 49-star flag that was not so pretty as his own design, but not so totalitarian as the 7 rows of 7 stars each, all lined up foursquare like soldiers on parade. His firm took a loss of several $100,000 in the scrapping of the old 48-star model. He fully expects to lose another small fortune on the thriftless project of manufacturing about 400,000 49-star flags that will be obsolete by 1960. He is possibly the second unhappiest man in the United States. The first is undoubtedly Representative W.R. Pogue of Texas, who carried the ball for the South and for sanity till the last moment of defeat. It was bad enough for a Texan to suffer the admission of Alaska, a state more than twice the size of Texas, but now appeared an applicant with a higher per capita annual income than the oil barons can boast. Moreover, a state whose main industries, sugar-cane and pineapples, are said by no less a segregationist than Senator James Eastland of Mississippi to be caught in the stranglehold of the Communists, or at least of Harry Bridges' International Longshoremen's Union. It was hardly mentioned in the congressional debate that the Hawaiians long ago solved their problem by the nightmare expedient used to frighten children in the South, by carefree intermarriage, so that today the islands flaunt a vigorously polyglot people whose strains include 37% Japanese, 17% Filipino, 24% Caucasian, 7% Chinese, and only 3% of the original pure Hawaiians. This frightful statistic was always in the front of the Southerners' minds and explains the 15 opposing senators and 2/3 of the 89 nays in the House. The South, indeed, is the political loser in more things than ideology or racial cant. Its grip on the Senate is increasingly flaccid. In the great days, which are almost any days before the Supreme Court's 1954 ruling, The 22 Southerners in '96 could always promise support for the Conservatives in many fields in exchange for a vote against civil liberties. Next year there will be 22 Southerners in 100. Some of their own have broken with them for good on the crucial question. Men from the Southwest rally guiltily around Senator Lyndon Baines Johnson of Texas, and, since the political fulcrum is moving to the West, hope to be mistaken for Westerners rather than Southerners. And now both the Alaskan senators and probably the Hawaiians will be Democrats, actively allied with the Northern liberals. As the latest and last territory eligible for statehood, Hawaii has put the seal on its political and economic maturity in a way that Alaska could not claim. Hawaii already bears the costs of its public schools, has an excellent system of courts that needs only to change its inscriptions and its notepaper to become a state judicial system. Its annual income exceeds that of 26 states, and its per capita income is only $2 less than the national average. Its shipping is thoroughly unionized by the aforesaid International Longshoremen's Union, and its minimum wage is $1 an hour. Today it was not bothering to advertise these healthy qualifications. The sirens, the bells, the klaxons, and the hula dancers were letting off the headier steam of pride in their first-class citizenship, in the real power they can wield in Congress, in the luck of history that has made them, 2,000 miles out in the Pacific, the first all-American ambassadors to suspicious Asians of the same breed and bone structure. A Catholic as presidential candidate? Guardian, 10 December, 1959. After a rather harrowing autumn, spent wondering if our entertainment heroes are bribed, our cranberries are poisoned, and our meat weighed down by the butcher's thumb, we in the United States have now turned to comparatively academic subjects, like birth control for the Africans and Asians, or what will life be like in AD 2000, when there will be just enough room on the globe for one human being per square yard. The official United Nations calculation says per square meter, and this may be pure propaganda on the part of the UN to make Britain change before it is too late to the metric system, or forego those extra 10 or 11 square inches of living space. Birth control for Asia is about the unlikeliest slogan you can imagine for an American presidential election. But that is the way it came at us this week, producing a peremptory quarrel between the World Council of Protestant Churches and the Catholic Bishops of America, causing the President to say as quickly as he could at his press conference that he could not imagine a subject less proper for political discussion, and putting Senator John F. Kennedy of Massachusetts on the firing line. I can hear some people say, "I haven't the foggiest idea what you're talking about, and will you start all over again and take it gently?" I will. May I say, too, that I am not going to upset anyone, I hope, by going into a debate about birth control. Not because, at this late date, we need to be squeamish about who believes in it and who does not, but because I would be a poor reporter if I got off on that tack. For the United States has not been debating birth control either, or even the wisdom of countries like India having increasingly more mouths than it is possible for them to feed with even a starvation diet. What Americans have been arguing about is Senator Kennedy, who is the first serious Roman Catholic candidate for the presidency since 1928, when Al Smith, the governor of New York, was actually nominated by the Democrats, was subjected to dreadful humiliations and hysterical abuse from the old Ku Klux Klan especially, and lost disastrously in the election that put Herbert Hoover in the White House. ever since Senator Kennedy appeared on Stevenson's presidential platforms and on some of his own in 1952, he impressed the country markedly, if not strongly, with the image of a coltish, fair-haired, all-American boy, modest in manner, conspicuously bright and well-informed, with the still visible halo of a heroic war record. He came close to panicking the 1956 Democratic Convention, for he almost snatched the vice presidency away from Estes Kefauver. I should explain, in a hurried footnote, that Estes Kefauver is not the Vice President of the United States, but in the roar and tramp of a convention, everyone who is nominated is hailed and introduced as the next President or the next Vice President, or whatever is the office. Kefauver got the nomination by a hair, and Kennedy, being then 39 years of age, lived to fight another day, not this time for the Vice Presidency, but for the supreme office itself. In the last 3 years, Kennedy has become a considerable, if still boyish, figure in Washington. The most alert of prosecutors on the Senate committee that looked into the sins of the Teamsters and other labor unions, and yet the man who has remained labor's idol, if it has such, in Washington. Last autumn, he was returned to the Senate from Massachusetts with the hugest majority ever given a senator in that state, and his stock went as high as it is likely to go before the Democratic Convention next year. His stock, that is, with the pros, for nothing is more impressive to the politicians who have to choose the candidate than a smashing victory in an off-year election. That is to say, in an election year when there is no presidential contest. For the last year, Senator Kennedy has been pulling steadily ahead of all the newcomers in the Democratic Party, and though he has not actually come out and declared himself as a presidential candidate, that, in this country, is a pure courtesy that waits for the arrival of a man's fans in New Hampshire to put his name on the ballot there. New Hampshire, a small New England state, carries no weight and few votes in the election itself, but it has the distinction of staging the first primary election at the beginning of March, when both parties put on the ballot the men they would like to have for president. Thus it is possible that there will be 2 or 3 Democrats running against each other in New Hampshire, and perhaps a couple of Republicans. New Hampshire's primary has been called a popularity vote or beauty contest, and its only power, like that of some other primaries in Wisconsin and Ohio, is the dreaded power in politics of killing off an ambitious man. We won't get our blood pressure up too high just yet about the Ides of March, when the New Hampshire primary takes place. Certainly, however, we know that Senator Kennedy is going to have his name on the ballot there, and probably also in Wisconsin, Ohio, and Oregon. He is running as fast as any man ever has, as fast as Thomas Edmund Dewey did before he, too, was willing to pause around the bend and admit that he was in the race. According to the polls, Kennedy has pulled ahead of Adlai Stevenson as the most popular choice for the Democratic nomination. And here again I must pause, because explaining American politics is often a sequence of blood-curdling statements followed at once by rather niggling apologies. Adlai Stevenson is not in the race. Positively, Mr. Stevenson says, he is not going to run for president. He does not want it, and if anybody puts his name on the Oregon ballot, he is going to file the proper legal form to have it taken off again. Oregon is the only state where a man may be put on a ballot against his will. Stevenson has done this once before, and though I am sure that his motives are of an impeccable purity, the effect on the people who are for him, on the voter, is to deny him his favorite bride. The result of this is to make people go mad. There is nothing an American wants quite as much as something he is told he cannot have. So what happens is that the frustrated Stevenson fans ignore the regular ballot, I mean the actual printed form, and write in the name of their man. Stevenson got a tremendous write-in vote in one famous primary last time, and though he says that having lost twice, he would not think of embarrassing the party again, there are still millions of Americans on their knees chanting, "Say it ain't so, Adlai." I hope the relative positions of Kennedy and Stevenson are now clear. Kennedy is 42, the biggest vote-getter in his party, and he is absolutely running for president. And he is catching up with Adlai Stevenson, who is 59, the most disastrous Democratic loser in 2 generations, and not running at all. In other words, it must now be childishly plain that Stevenson, standing still, is just ahead of Kennedy, who is running like mad. I still have not got around to birth control, and you must not put this down to coyness or any other embarrassment. The moment you begin to talk about any issue that touches on next year's presidential election, in no time at all Stevenson's name pops up, and we begin to talk about him as the man whose opinion and public appeal will have to be reckoned with, if not consulted. It is Stevenson's peculiar, and to some people infuriating, strength that the more thoroughly he takes himself out of the race and retreats into darkest obscurity, the more he looms up on the distant horizon as a blinding light. Stevenson had nothing at all to do with the birth control row, but I don't seem to be able to get away from it. Down, Adlai, down! To begin at the beginning of this tantalizing theme, we should have to go back to last winter and the report of a United Nations Commission. It was a commission on population. It issued a report on the coming population explosion on our globe, introducing some pretty scary stuff. For instance, that the population of the United States would double in the next 40 years, whereas it took us before that 100 years, and before that 200 years, to do the same thing. Oddly enough, nobody seems to be getting excited about birth control for the Americans. Maybe we are waiting for some disinterested African or Indian to put that one up. The report gave us the basic figures on which we now gloomily calculate our hemmed-in future. In particular, the report said that one of the most striking and ominous signs of our time was the dramatic decline in the death rates of Asia and Africa, while their birth rate stayed as high as ever. The consequence was, the report said, that unless something was done, these people would breed more and more people who would have to live on less and less food. The World Council of Protestant Churches pondered this report and thought that maybe something should be done now about recommending birth control to countries that could use it. 10 days ago, the Catholic bishops of America came out with a counterblast, saying that they were against birth control here, there, or anywhere, and that the only decent cure for groaning populations who are also starving was to increase the world's supply of food. The Episcopal bishops of America snapped back, and then, a week ago, Senator Kennedy's telephone rang one Friday evening, and on the other end was the familiar voice of Mr. James Reston, the chief Washington correspondent of the New York Times, who, and not for the first time, brought a great but vague issue into sharp focus and discovered that in this country a political doctrine has its greatest pull in the force of a political personality. He asked Senator Kennedy how he felt about the Catholic bishop's statement. The senator said that since this country had never laid down a birth control policy for the United States or Western Europe, it would be a psychological mistake for us to suggest that the black, brown, and yellow countries should begin to limit their populations. He also said if he were president and the government did lay down a policy of spreading birth control information as part of our foreign aid, he would have to use his best judgment at the time. Pressed still further, he said that if Congress passed such a law, then he would uphold it as the law of the land. It is hard to think of a more astute or statesmanlike attitude for any man to take. But Senator Kennedy is a Roman Catholic, and what Mr. Reston was asking him in effect was, would there ever come a point, when his loyalty to the Church might clash with his presidential oath of loyalty to the Constitution? If this seems a little unreal, even spiteful, across the Atlantic, let me say that Mr. Reston's question touches the nerve of one of the great realities of American politics and history. The people who crossed the Atlantic to escape religious persecution set up here a government that contains a famous prohibition. The government says in the Constitution, "The Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion." Americans are told from the earliest days of their Constitution to never forget that church and state must be forever separate. The fear that dogs the candidacy of Senator Kennedy is a fear that he, as a devout Catholic, might one day forget this unforgettable law.
1960 to 1969. The 1960s were crunch years, I think, for my father. His pieces for The Guardian seemed to me, and I think to him as well, unrelenting. During this especially eventful decade, the daily article often expanded to 3 or more. His weekly radio broadcasts also carried the deadline gavel, but it was the dessert of his professional offering, and he had a very big sweet tooth. Though in those days he generally didn't plan what he would talk about until he actually sat down at the typewriter, he relished the freedom and license that the letter from America provided. Sometimes this was getting away from the politics he had been masticating all week, and sometimes it was the simple pleasure of savoring the more subtle nuances of a particular event or individual. His pedal was to the metal at this time, his professional life still accelerating, his energy full, and his commitment to both The Guardian and BBC entrenched. It is worth repeating that he was not much of a celebrity during this particular decade in America, since Omnibus was over and Masterpiece Theatre was yet to begin. During this time he was 100% reporter, and there was much to report. Not a great fan of President Kennedy, he was nevertheless intrigued by America's fascination with the Camelot White House. Though he questioned on several occasions Kennedy's leadership, he appreciated the sophistication and cultural awakening he, and especially Mrs. Kennedy, brought to Washington. He took to Lyndon Johnson, however, pretty much immediately. Whether this came, following Kennedy's assassination, from the kind of relief a drowning person feels on being thrown a lifeline, or from a genuine appreciation of his apparent country boy directness, he saw him from the first through rose-colored glasses and remained loyal to him during his increasingly troubled presidency. The social and political unrest of the 1960s was at first somewhat of a nagging irritant to my father. He was initially dismissive of the generation of young people who took to the streets in protest against the establishment's politics or social norms. At best, he considered them naive and disrespectful, and at worst, rude and dangerous. He disapproved of the methods, though clearly not the goals, of many of the leaders of the civil rights movement, Malcolm X and the Reverend Adam Clayton Powell in particular. He held decency in high regard and was impatient and dismayed by the hippie movement and what he considered its flagrant disregard for manners and authority. The trouble was that I was part of the generation he was inclined to dismiss. In 1965, I went away to school in Vermont and was thus distanced from inner-city protests, the civil rights and growing anti-war movements that were championed by people my age and just slightly older. Not a political activist, I didn't take a bus to Selma to work in the South or endeavor in any way to cross the line of acceptable discourse. I have wondered why this was, why, given the fact that I attended a very liberal school, I wasn't the adamant activist many of my friends were. Only in retrospect, and somewhat sheepishly, do I see that having my father's view so articulately and constantly expressed influenced my thinking and behavior. I was torn between an impassioned, radical, and I suspected just stance, and an erudite, reasoned, and persuasive argument that I questioned. In the end, it simply was more important to me at the time not to rock the boat at home. Perhaps as protection against what threatened to divide us, Daddy and I made more of an effort to tread on neutral ground together. We began our tradition of regularly sharing jokes and watching late-night thrillers on television. Whenever an event not linked to politics captured the news, we delighted in consuming its every detail. The exploration of space enthralled us both. When John Glenn became a friend of my father's through their work as editors of the World Book Encyclopedia, he relished sharing the tidbits Glenn had imparted. Daddy was fascinated by science and technology, and both the space program and medicine would prove lifelong interests, providing relief from constant political reporting.
Mr. Kennedy takes over. Guardian, 26 January 1961. Snow swirling from home, or persuaded by their memories of television's earlier conquests to stay in their homes and share the privilege of the ordinary American householder to switch a knob and hop around as a fly on the wall of history. From the moment in mid-morning when we saw some of the rumply 35 White House staff members who had been marooned in the White House overnight join President Eisenhower at a coffee break in the Navy mess, the cameras of 3 networks kept up an unbroken scrutiny of every move of the Eisenhowers, the Nixons, the Lyndon Johnsons, the Kennedys leaving their house, the ride to the White House, the ride from the White House, the bland demeanor of the diplomatic corps exchanging compliments of each other's hats, the close-up of a saturnine Justice Felix Frankfurter and an expansive Justice William O. Douglas, the lifted eyebrows of Eisenhower and Mrs. Kennedy as a rabbi burst into a Jewish prayer, the restrained alarm of the Marines and Senator John Sparkman, the inauguration host, when the smoking breath of the principals grew dense and was seen to be a separate cloud issuing from a fire that had broken out in a heater under the lectern. This momentary fright and a mix-up in the seating delayed the taking of the oath for a full half-hour. But Kennedy was sitting on the left hand of Eisenhower, and Eisenhower is a famous talker, and Ike regaled the new man with anecdotes and reflections and busy gestures for 20 minutes or more, while we went through the traditional rituals of patriotic selections played, as always since 1801, by the band of the Marine Corps, while various rattled officials sniffed at the fire and argued with it. The people could share, in fully amplified sound, the boredom of the famous, as they listened to long prayers being intoned or rasped out by a Catholic cardinal, a Greek Orthodox archbishop, a Protestant clergyman, and a rabbi, who always prolonged their finest hour by turning these supplications into their own variation of the inaugural address. While the invocations and beseechings barked or droned on the winter air, the cameras put together a portrait gallery of the victors and the falling in action. Adlai Stevenson, the only member of the executive branch in a felt hat instead of a topper, chewing the cud of his 2 defeats and talking to no one. Harry Truman, in unbelievable Christian fettle, chatting affably with the enemy, Nixon. The features trenched with age of a little old lady nestled close to the peach-bloom fuzz of Mrs. Kennedy's pretty face. Chief Justice Earl Warren sitting at the alert immediately behind Kennedy, and preserving at all times the impassivity of a melon. And all the time Kennedy inclining over to the voluble Ike and listening without a fidget, his fine hands slightly clasped. At last old Speaker Sam Rayburn rose to administer the vice-presidential oath to his fellow Texan, Lyndon Johnson, whom he had labored so to install on the president's throne. Then there was a prayer, handsomely praising the earthly capacities of Mr. Johnson by a Texan clergyman. Then old Robert Frost was summoned to read an old poem with a new introduction composed specially for this day. The sun flashed wounding reflections on his failing eyes, and he stumbled through the introduction, threw in a despairing aside, "I'm not in a good light, I can't get through this thing," abandoned his text, and spoke the poem loud and strong, but with his fingers kneading his palms in a secret fury, and his white hair lapping in waves against his forehead. Kennedy was the first to tap his shoulder and reassure him with a grasp of the hand. After that, Chief Justice Warren stood to the right of the lectern. Kennedy put his left hand on a family Bible, raised his right, and repeated the immemorial oath to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States, so help me God. Then, with never a quaver, he delivered the simple, rolling cadences of what is certainly one of the simplest and most eloquent of inaugural addresses. This is not a victory of party, but a celebration of freedom. Let every nation know, whether it wishes us well or ill, that we are here to assure the survival and the success of liberty. To those old allies we pledge the loyalty of faithful friends. To those in huts and villages of half the globe we pledge our best efforts to help men help themselves. If we cannot help the many who are poor, we cannot help the few who are rich. This hemisphere intends to remain the master of its own house. At the end, when the cheers rose from the shivering crowd, Eisenhower gave 2 slaps, tweaked his nose, shook Kennedy's hand, and Kennedy walked out as cool, but alive to small courtesies and distant nods, as an admiral being piped aboard. That, in a way, is what was happening, for the Marine Band, which had been interspersing the oaths and prayers with homely but traditional ruffles and flourishes, now burst with new zest into the presidential tune, "Hail to the Chief." The cameras roamed over a huge square packed with thousands of ordered dots. Beyond these frozen eyewitnesses was Constitution Plaza and the Hill and Pennsylvania Avenue, a continuous ribbon of bare highway, the only naked street in Washington. Beyond that were the houses slumped in snowbanks, and a frozen landscape for thousands of miles housing the warm, remote population that had seen Robert Frost's moment of misery, and Mrs. Kennedy's smooth throat twitch for a second as the unbearable office passed over from the oldest president to the youngest.